Okay, hi everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We really are so excited to see that there are so many people interested in bird ID in Newfoundland. That's fantastic. So I'm just going to briefly do a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to let Jenna McDermott take it away. I am Catherine Dale. I am the coordinator of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And Jenna McDermott, who's doing tonight's presentation, is our assistant coordinator. If you're not sure what the Breeding Bird Atlas is, that is something you're going to be hearing about from Jenna just briefly in a little bit. Just a few things before we get going. The first is that there are quite a few of us. So we're hitting 150 participants at the moment, and technically we're actually sold out for tonight, so that's almost 300 people. So if you could all keep your microphones muted, just to stop any background noise from interfering with the presentation, that would be amazing. Also, we're going to ask you to hold questions till the end. So Jenna is going to take us through some sort of beginner birding stuff. The presentation takes about an hour, but we are going to stick around for a question period at the end for 15 minutes or so. So if you have questions, just hang on to them till the end. When it comes to the end, you can either type them into the chat and I'll be monitoring the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask them out loud. As long as we don't have a whole bunch of people try to ask questions at the same time. If that ends up happening, we may just go through the chat. One note, we're probably not going to be able to help you if you have questions about a specific bird that you saw in your backyard last week. If that's the case, first, we'd like you to try and use some of the skills that you pick up tonight to see if you can ID it yourself. But if you're still struggling with it, you can send us an email with a picture, if you have one, or a description, or if you want to crowdsource the identification, you can post it on the Newfoundland and Labrador Birdwatching Group Facebook page, because they actually are fantastic at helping with bird ID. So we're hoping that questions are going to maybe not focus so much on identifying individual birds. Does anyone have any questions before we get going? I'm not seeing anything in the chat. I'm not hearing from anyone, so I'm going to turn it over to Jenna.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. Can you see me or hear me?
Yes, Jenna, we can hear you, and I can see you as well.
Perfect. Okay, that's great to hear. I'll just second Catherine's welcome. I'm glad you're all here tonight and that you're here to learn a little bit more about identifying birds. So we'll just start our presentation here. And I'll just begin by telling you a little bit about Birds Canada, which is the organization that Catherine and I both work for. It is a national organization, so we have offices all across Canada. And we run a whole bunch of different projects that are mainly based on citizen science. And citizen science is basically people like you, volunteers who are interested or passionate about a subject, who are collecting data and submitting it to be part of our long-term data sets that we have for these different projects. So the mission of Birds Canada is to conserve wild birds through sound science, on-the-ground actions, innovative partnerships, public engagement, and science-based advocacy. So right now in Newfoundland, we are part of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And this is a 5-year project. We're just going into the 3rd year right now. And the project is to map the distribution and the abundance of the birds that breed in Newfoundland. So we're really looking to find out where all the species are and how many of them are here. And so this relies a lot, again, on citizen scientists, so volunteers around the island, going around and showing or telling us where they found all of the bird species, and then it goes into a central database and we can end up mapping them. And it ends up at the end of the period, we'll get a map very much like this one. You can see that is for rusty blackbird, about the abundance of birds in certain areas. So as you can see, Newfoundland right now is missing from that map, but we do have rusty blackbirds here actually. So an atlas like this is going to really fill in some missing holes in information. So it's really important to have that information to be able to conserve these species in the coming years. We also are running a project called the Nocturnal Owl Survey for the Atlantic provinces. It's also in the Maritimes. And Catherine sort of heads that up. And the basic gist of that project is that in the early spring, you could sign up for a route that you drive. It has 10 stops involved. Basically, you go out and you listen to any owls that you are hearing and record where they are. And then that goes into, again, a database of where owls can be found across the island. So it's a pretty cool project. So if you're interested in joining that one, you can certainly get a hold of us by email. I'll have some contact information up at the end. And as well as the Atlas, we'll be having some more sessions about the Atlas at the end of this 12-week session. I think on the, let me see, April 4th, we have an Atlasing for Beginners session. So if you're interested in the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas, feel free to absolutely sign up for that one as well. And just before we get into the meat of this presentation, I'd like to thank our supporters and our funders, because without all of them, we wouldn't be able to do things like this. So just quick note there. And this is the outline of what we're going to go through tonight. So we're not really going to be focusing in on specific species or how to identify like many very specific species, but we're going to be going through sort of broad-based strokes of what tools you can use to help you identify birds, the basic knowledge that you can use of what to look for when you're identifying birds. And then we'll go through the major bird families that are found in Newfoundland so that you'll have a bit of an idea of the diversity out there and how to start picking them apart about who goes where. Okay, so the first thing that is going to be really helpful for you if you're learning to identify birds is getting a pair of binoculars. Of course, you can always look at birds just with your eyes without any sort of optics, but having binoculars is really quite helpful because often birds that you're looking at are going to be far off in the distance or a bit tricky to see the key identifying features just with your eyes. So binoculars, they're really a tool just to help bring the bird up closer to you so that you can really get those key features that you need to identify them. When you're first looking for binoculars, you'll notice that they always have 2 numbers associated with them. So this pair here that you can see is 8 by 42, and the 8 indicates what magnification they are. So that is magnification of the lens that's close to your eye. It'll be 8 times magnified, and the aperture is 42. And the aperture just tells you sort of how much light is coming in. And so 42 is a bit of a mid-range there. 8 by 42 is a really good number to look for. You might think that if you could get a 10 times magnified binocular, that'd be better. But that's not necessarily the case because it gets to be a bit harder to deal with a higher magnification to keep the binocular steady or keep the bird in the frame. So 8 by 42 is a really good number to look for when you're looking for binoculars. 2 brands that are sort of mid-price and still really good quality are Nikon and Vortex. And I'll be sending out a little email after the presentation with the key things like that. So you don't need to worry about jotting stuff like that down.
Okay.
And I'll also say, sorry, just muted for a second.
Sorry, Jenna, that was me.
That's okay. Since there are several different brands and stuff of binoculars or different kinds, it's important to, if you have a chance, try out different ones because they'll come in a bit of different sizes. So like, for example, my eyes are fairly narrowly set together. So not all of them can have the 2 eyepieces bring the picture together. So if you have the opportunity to try friends or families binoculars, if they have any, or if you're shopping at a store, they'll let you try them out. I would definitely recommend it. All right, so another thing about binoculars is that there's a special little thing with the eye caps about whether or not that you can use if you wear glasses or don't wear glasses. So you can always raise the eye cap up or like leave it down, and that is usually on like a swivel system or a flip system, where you'll just be able to twist it up. So if you wear glasses or you're wearing sunglasses, you want to keep that eye cap down as far as it can go, like on the left there. And if you're not wearing glasses, you want to leave it up as high as it can go, because this will just help with the distance between the lens and your eye and helps to focus it better. So when you're actually going to start using your binoculars, it's tempting, of course, to just like put them up to your face and start looking around and try and find things. But actually, you'll find it far easier and maybe less frustrating if you find the bird or whatever thing you're looking for with your eyes first and your ears, and look at it, and then just raise the binoculars up to where you're looking. That way you're not trying to focus while you're already magnified, and that'll be way less frustrating. So just look at the bird and then put your binoculars up. And that's just a quick little tip for using binoculars in a successful manner. And also, when you first get your binoculars, and it's a skill like any other, so you're probably going to have to practice using them. And it may seem silly, but you can go around in your house and find a picture on the wall or something in your house, and just practice putting your binoculars up to your face until you can successfully get that image into the field of vision consistently. And that way, when you're going out into the world and you're looking at birds or other things, then you'll be able to do that without getting quite so frustrated about not being able to find them. So the next thing that's going to be really important while you're learning to identify birds or identifying birds is having a good field guide. So there's a lot of different field guides around. You can get paper copies from the library or buy them yourself. There's several different kinds of field guides. So there's painted field guides, and they're going to have, for each bird species, they'll have an image, a painted image of each bird, and that will show the key identifying features, usually with an arrow, sometimes pointing to them for each of the species. That's a bit different from a photographic field guide, because instead of paintings, they'll have photographs, as you would expect. And so they won't always necessarily show you all of the identifying features in such a clear fashion, but you're going to have a more lifelike picture, of course, because it is a real picture. So that's just a personal preference thing about what people like to use. You could also get regional field guides. So for example, the Sibley's Bird Guide is a very popular one that's widely used. But if you have a Sibley's Bird Guide, it's going to likely be for all of North America. But you can also get Sibley's Birds to the East. And this is the case for many different field guides. And so that way, if you're taking your field guide out with you while you're out and about, you don't have to lug around this big book. You have a book that's about half the size, and you still have probably all of the information in it that you need while you're out. So there's a few different regional guides as well. Newfoundland also has a Birds of Newfoundland book that's specifically the birds that are found in Newfoundland. Not every species, but definitely the most common ones that you'll find. So those are good options if you're planning on taking a field guide out while you're out hiking or walking or out in the car with you. You can also get reference guides like the Shorebird Guide or the Warbler Guide. And these are like really usually quite large, hefty books. And they're not necessarily ones that you're wanting to carry around outside with you because they're going to be pretty heavy. But they're good to keep at home if you have a certain interest in like one family. And you can go back with questions from your trip outside and look things up afterwards. So those ones are really nice to have as well. So there are all these different kinds of field guides. And the library is going to be a really helpful place for you to find one that you like the best, because the library usually, public libraries typically have a pretty good selection, or at least a few different books. So you could find one that you like, and then you'll be able to, before you want to put in the money to buy it, if you're interested in buying one. There's a really cool program going on in Newfoundland right now as well. That's a partnership through the public libraries and Nature Newfoundland and Labrador. So they have these bird watching backpacks that you can rent out of the library like you would any book. And so they're out in the Avalon right now, and I think they have some in Corner Brook as well, and maybe in Grand Falls, Windsor. I'm not entirely sure about that, but definitely check out your local library and see if they have a bird watching backpack. They come with a pair of binoculars, a field guide, and other activities, and they also have children's versions as well with like kid-sized binoculars, which is really cool. So use your library to your advantage. So this is an example of Sibley's Guide to Birds, which is the one I mentioned, and it is a painted field guide. And so what you'll see on any species page, like here, the great horned owl, is you'll have like a little description at the top of the bird. It'll indicate the size of the bird in like inches or centimeters, and then it'll have paintings of a male, usually a female, sometimes a juvenile, and sometimes non-breeding plumage as well. So it has different paintings for different birds. It'll also always have sort of a blurb about habitat or a description of the voice, and it will always have a range map as well that shows you where the bird is expected to be. And so this is the National Geographic book here is another version of a field guide, just a different option, another painted one. And I just wanted to show you that even though it looks different, the layout is different, it still has the same information. So it still has these paintings of the birds that have males and females. For example, it has these little blurbs with the size and information about habitat and the voice, and they are always going to have a range map. So field guides are typically organized by families, and families of birds are, for example, like the woodpeckers, are birds that are similar genetically. And so they're organized by families in taxonomic order. And that's basically how genetically related a species are. And so depending on the age of your field guide or which version of a field guide you have, the ordering might differ a little bit between them, just because new information comes in, new studies are done on genetics. But that's not something that you really need to worry about. Once you pick a field guide that you like the best, that you either buy or borrow from the library all the time, you can just get used to the order that it is in that one. So if you're looking at a different field guide than what you're used to, and you can't find a family where you expected it to be, you don't need to worry about that. It'll be somewhere else in the book, and it's just because of how the taxonomy has changed since the last version.
Jenna, I'm just going to mute everybody again, so you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yep. Yeah, so that's the basics of that part of field guides. So as I said, they would always have a range map in them. And this tells you roughly where and when a bird is likely to be seen per species. And these range maps are going to be split into different seasons. So you usually have breeding season, migration, non-breeding, and year-round, and they'll be symbolized by different colors along the map. And the range map is really good to look at if, for example, you see a yellow bird and you look through your field guide and there's so many different yellow birds. But it's important to look at the range map because some of those aren't even going to be in the location where you are, or they aren't expected to be there. So always take a look at it. Just do be careful because range maps, just like the ordering of species inside of a field guide, range maps can also change over time as more information comes in, or even as species change the range where they live, if they expand north or south or up mountains, that sort of thing. Oops, sorry. But definitely keep a range map keep the range map in your idea of an important thing to look at in your field guide, but also take the information on it with a little grain of salt, just in case things have changed since that map was created. So in addition to paper field guides, you can also get a lot of field guides that are digital ones built for smartphones or tablets. And these ones, some examples are iBird Pro, Sibley's Birds of North America. And I think both of those, you need to pay for them just as you would for a paper field guide, and they have all the same information. And then there's other ones like the Audubon Bird Guide, which is free. And these ones are nice because they have all of the information that you would have, like a range map and descriptions of habitat and pictures and that sort of thing. But they also have typically song files. So if you're interested in listening to what a bird sounds like, they'll have song files in there as well. There are other bird guides like Merlin Bird ID, which is also free, which can function as both a field guide and also as an ID tool. And I'll get into that one a little bit more later. But for the field guide section of it, you can just click on the Explore Birds part, and it will bring up a list of birds that are in your area, and you can look through them all, click on them all, and it will give you pictures and still the descriptions and range maps and all that sort of thing. So you can use it just like a paper field guide and just carry it around in your pocket a little bit easier. Okay, so let's get a little bit closer to actually identifying some birds. Some tips for when you're getting started. My first biggest tip is that mistakes are going to happen. Even the most expert birder is going to make some ID mistakes, and that's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's a learning curve for everybody. Everybody has started as a beginner. So that's a good thing to just accept right off the bat. Another thing is that sometimes you just can't get to ID a species down to the species level. Sometimes the lighting is bad, the bird is covered by leaves or trees, you just can't get a good look, and you just can't identify it down to species. That's also fine too. And so I'll encourage everybody, if you're really new to identifying species, to start with your common birds that are around your house or your neighborhood or your cabin where you always are, and just really take a look at them. And so, for example, like an American robin, a lot of people are familiar with those, and you may just glance at them usually, but really take a look at them and see what it is about that bird that makes it an American robin. So you might notice the legs or the face or the coloration or what it's doing. And also when you're first starting to identify birds and you see something really cool in the bush and you like catch a glimpse of color or like a little look at it, you might be tempted to quickly look into your field guide and start looking up what it could be. But I'll also encourage you to just keep looking at the bird for a while, for just a couple of minutes. Just take in as many clues about identification as you can. So you're going to want to look for shape and size and context and what colors it is, and try and get as much information as you possibly can before you go to your field guide, and then you'll be so much more prepared to try and find what species it is in there. And again, as I said before, sometimes you can only identify birds to the family or to the group. Like you might see a bird floating on the water pretty far away, and you know that it's a duck, but that's all you can tell because it's just the lighting is bad. And that's also perfectly fine. You're doing great. And then the last little tip for getting started, I'd say, is to just spend time with the field guide that you decide you enjoy the best and learn it. Just leave it on your coffee table or on your bedside table. And every time you get, just flip through it, not necessarily to study it specifically, but just to get an idea of everything that's in there. And even from just flipping through your guide, you're going to get so much information. Okie dokie. So we're going to get into these four key ideas that you need to learn to identify birds and really to identify anything in the world. This is something that we practice every day, is to look at the shape, the size, the context, and the coloration of any object, and then we can figure out what it is. So for example, I'll use this orange that I have here in my kitchen. So the shape of it is round, it's round, completely circular. It's about the size of a fist, pretty small. The context is that it's a food, or it's found in a kitchen or maybe on a tree. And it's an orange color. And so from all of those four key cues, we can figure out that this is an orange. So a lot of different things are round. A lot of things are around this size. There's a lot of different types of food, and there's a lot of orange things in the world, but a combination of those 4 things can let you identify that this is an orange. So we're going to use these same cues for birds as we do for everything that we see every day. The first thing that I'll start with is the shape. So the shape in birds, what we're specifically going to be looking for, especially because sometimes you're only going to see a silhouette of a bird or a shape of a bird in the distance, you're going to be looking at the shape of the neck specifically, the tail, the beak, and the wings, and also of the bird generally. So for example, here we have 3 silhouettes, and all of these birds have long beaks. We can notice that straight off the bat. And then we'll look for maybe some different differences in shape, other differences that we can see. So the one on the tallest one on the right has a really long neck. And then the one in the middle has sort of a medium-sized neck. And the one on the left has really short neck, or basically no neck at all. It's just its like head was plopped right onto its shoulders and has no neck. So from that alone, just looking at these little clues about the shape, we can tell that these are 3 different species. The Peterson Field Guide has this little page in it that's really handy and sort of highlights the importance of shape. And they call it roadside silhouettes. So these are, I guess, common roadside birds in North America. And it just can, if you just take a look at all the different birds in here, you can start to notice the differences in shape. So take a look at the pointiness of the beak, or how long it is. Or look at number 27 down at the bottom, which is a pheasant, which we don't really have here very much, but just look at that long tail that's pointing upward and it's really sharp. Versus, let's say, number 12, this blue jay in the tree, and it has like a medium-sized tail. It's sort of fan-shaped. So this just really highlights all the information you can get from looking at the shapes of birds and parts of the birds. Another time when shape can be really helpful is when you're looking at birds in flight. I'm not going to get really into this too much, but if you look at the shape of the wings as a bird is flying, and the shape of the tail again, you can get a lot of information, especially for raptors, the birds of prey. So for example, falcons have pointed, really sharp pointed wings, whereas bootios have more rounded wings and rounded tails. So that's just something to watch out for while you're watching birds fly overhead as well. Another really important part to look at the shape of is the bill. So we have a few different basic shapes, like a long and straight bill, which is present on a lot of different shorebirds because they're using that bill to probe into the ground and pull out food. And we also have a wedge-shaped bill, and we have hooked bills. And the bill for a bird is basically its tool for collecting food, because they don't have arms or anything like that. So they're always using their bill to collect food. So it's really shaped towards their lifestyle. So for example, on a raptor, a bird of prey, they have this hooked bill that's used for ripping their prey. We could have short and conical bills that are good for crushing things. We have short pointed bills that are like little tweezers. They're good for picking insects off of trees and leaves. And then you can have this like quintessential duck bill, a broad and flattened one, which is used to strain insects or plant matter out of water. So if you always take a look at the shape of the bill, it'll give you a good indication of probably what family at least you're looking at for this bird. Sometimes the shape can be a little bit confusing. For example, we have these 3 birds. We have a downy woodpecker on the left, an American robin in the middle, and a blue jay. And depending on the temperature outside or how the bird is feeling, if it's relaxed or stressed, or how it was signaling another bird, it might change the shape that it is. So for example, this downy woodpecker is nice and sleek and slim, but then it's cold outside and it gets really poofy and a little bit chubbier. Same thing this robin. If it's cold outside, it's going to look like a big fat tennis ball. And like this blue jay here, it has a big crest on top of its head. That's pretty diagnostic when you look at it. Everyone might recognize a blue jay by its crest, but if it's feeling relaxed, then it might have that those feathers on the top of its head pressed down into the head, so it will look like a different shape. So do be aware that shapes can change sometimes, but they are very helpful. So I'll move on to the size. This is our second key identifier. And the size of things, we usually use it more as like a rough gauge for a rough estimate, rather than your field guide will have that a bird is like 30 centimeters tall or 12 inches tall or something like that. But that's not really going to be helpful to you in the field, knowing like a few centimeters difference or a few inches difference in size. But sizes, you're going to be looking more at rough sizes. You can also look at sizes of pieces of a bird in relation to itself, and this is relative proportions. So for example, a downy woodpecker and hairy woodpecker are very similar looking birds, as you can see. And people say that a downy woodpecker has a short bill and a hairy woodpecker has a long bill. But what exactly does that mean? If you're looking at one bird by itself, you're not going to be able to really tell what short or long means. But if you compare the size of the bill to its head, so for a downy woodpecker, the bill is less than half of the length of its head, so just about to the back of its eye if you flip the bill back on itself. And a hairy woodpecker's bill is much longer and it's greater than half the length of its head. So if you flip the bill back onto the head, it's way past the eye and nearly halfway to the back of its head. So you can use the sizes of pieces of the bird compared to itself as well. And you're also going to want to compare size to birds that you know. So there's going to be birds that you are more familiar with, like a goose or a crow. And so you don't necessarily need to know exactly how big in inches a bird is, but if you know it's a bit bigger than a robin, then that's going to help you when you're looking things up in your field guide. And another way to tell the size of birds compared to each other is also compared to other objects that you know the size of. So if you have a feeder outside or a fence post, that sort of thing, you can compare the size of the bird to the size of something else that you know. The next key that we'll talk about is context. So context is basically what the bird is doing, where the bird is, the time of year, its behavior, all that sort of information that's going to help you understand it a little bit better. So where is the bird? Is it on bare ground? Is it in open land? Is it on or under the water? All of these things are key information that can help you identify to a family or to a species. And as you get to know your birds a little bit better or more familiar with some species, you'll also be able to remember what sort of habitats you expect different species to be in. So for example, we have these two pictures here. You could probably expect an American robin to be in both of those habitats because they're generalists, they're sort of found everywhere. But if we're talking about a white-throated sparrow, which some of you maybe already know, you're probably more likely to find them only in the upper picture, sort of in the woods and not really out near human structures and in the open areas. So as you get to be more familiar, you will also be able to pick out pieces of location and habitat that are helpful to know what species you might be able to find there. Another piece that you can look at for context is the flight pattern that birds have. So we're not going to get into really specifics for species of this right now either, but it's something to watch out for. And sometimes it's described in your field guides as well, that birds can fly in a different fashion. So some of them flap, flap, glide. They just flap along and glide like accipiters, which is a sort of a bird of prey, or they can soar on thermals like large hawks or gulls, or they can also have an undulating flight that goes up and down, dips up and down, like finches or woodpeckers or chickadees, that sort of thing. So that's something to watch out for and something that can help you when you're learning to identify things. Another thing to look for is feeding behavior. So this can definitely help you identify at least to family a lot of the time. This is really important for shorebirds as well. And for ducks, here's an example. Ducks are split up into two sort of groupings. There's dabbling ducks and there's diving ducks. And so dabbling ducks are the ones that you see, they feed either just on top of the water, they're floating around, or they just tip their tails up in the air and they're feeding just underneath the surface of the water. On the other hand, we have diving ducks, and as you would expect, they submerge themselves completely underwater and dive down to the bottom to get fish or plants or mollusks or that sort of thing. So even if you only see some ducks way off in the distance on a lake or something, and you can't really tell anything other than how it is that they're feeding, you can already sort of pare it down to what group that they're in, which is pretty cool, just from seeing what they're doing. And the last key that we're going to touch on is coloration. And so I left this to the last of the four because the other three, shape, size, and context, are incredibly important. And if you rely only on coloration, sometimes it can lead you a bit astray with lighting. And also because, for example, these two birds, one is sort of a pink red and one of them is sort of a yellowy green. And you might think because they're different colors that they are completely different species. But in fact, we just have the male and the female of a pine grosbeak. So color is really important, but the other keys that we looked at before are also very important. So within a bird, there's certain areas that are going to be really helpful for you to look at for colors and patterns. One of them is on the face, and there's a few different things we can see on the face. In the upper left corner, you can see there's a line that goes through this bird's eye. And that's a common pattern that you can see on the face of birds, a line that either goes all the way to the back of the head, up through the beak, or only partially there. You look at how bold it is, or if it's barely visible, or if they don't have one at all. Those are all important. Down at the bottom, we have a yellow warbler, and its face is completely yellow with no patterns at all. And that's also an important clue. So even if you don't see any sort of markings or patterns, you should note that as well, because that's also going to be helpful to identify two species. You can also look for contrasting colorations, bold colors in different patterns, as well as rings around the eye. Birds often will have a ring around the eye that's either partially there, like only on half of it. It can either be really strong or again, quite weak. And so that's an important thing to look for as well. Another spot that can be helpful to look for patterns is on the breast and belly of a bird. And this is really helpful for sparrows, especially, and a lot of other things. But sparrows, you can look to see how much streaking there is on the breast and belly, if they have a central spot on the belly. And just take note of what you could see in that area. If there's bands of color, rings around the neck, or a bib present, that's an important spot to look. Another spot to look at is the wings. So there's often colors and patterns on the wings. You can see up in the top left, this bay-breasted warbler has two really bright white lines on its wing, which are called wing bars. So some birds have these and some birds don't. So that's an important thing to note. You can also see, for example, this American crow has no markings on its wing, which is again important. Just like the face had no markings, the wing having no markings is a good clue. And then other birds will have, especially, ducks will have this patch of really bright color that's visible when they're flying. And that's an important spot to look for to see what color it is or where it's located. That will really help with identification as well. And I'll note just before we move along that coloration can change, or it can be different between a male and female. So as you can see on the top here, this mallard male is quite bright colored, but the female mallard is brown. So sometimes the sexes can have different colors, which is called sexual dimorphism. And the same thing you can see with this house sparrow on the right. The male house sparrow has got some bright coloration on his back and head, and the female is a bit of a dull brown. So do be aware that different colored birds can still be the same species. Also do be aware that birds can look, the same species can look different in different seasons. So often birds will have a winter plumage. For example, this American goldfinch here, this bright yellow guy, in the winter will look a bit duller and be more of a brown color, but still the same species. Same thing with ducks. They'll go through an eclipse plumage, which is just a section of the summer when the males will look like a female. So you can see this bird down the bottom. There's a male amongst that group of female ducks, and they look very similar. So do be careful for seasonal variation in coloration as well. Okay, so those are the four main keys that you can use to start identifying birds. And you should try and always collect as many clues as you can of those four before you go to your field guide and start looking up what bird it might be. There are also some online bird identification I guess keys that you can use. So the Merlin app that we discussed earlier, you can also use a bird identification section. And basically it goes through the same things that we just were talking about. So here we have our bird in the corner. It's going to ask you where you saw the bird. It's going to ask when you saw the bird, what time of year. It's going to ask what size it is compared to other more common birds. It will ask the colors of the bird. And you could pick up to 3. So for this one, we would just put black and yellow because those are the 2 main colors of it. And then it will ask, where was it? And so here we're going to say it was in a tree or a bush, but you have all these other options, and this would be part of the context. So it goes along and it thinks about all that and creates a possible list of birds. And if you're in a service area, it will make a more curated list of birds depending on where you are. And if you're out of service, it still works, but the list is maybe not quite so accurate. And it'll come up with this list of potential options. And so in this case, the bird we were looking for was an American goldfinch, and is the first option, which is not always going to be true. But when you're just learning to start identifying birds, I'd encourage you to also look at the other species that it's suggesting here. So this is a great learning opportunity because it's giving you similar looking birds. And you can click on each one and take a look at how they're different or why it might not be the one that you saw. So this could be a really great learning opportunity, and also help you just figure out what you're seeing. Okay, so we are going to move on to chatting about the major families of birds that we can expect in Newfoundland during the summer. And so again, I'm not going to go into like really specifics about each different species, but we're going to talk about the similar characteristics of a family and how we can sort of start narrowing it down into families. So you'll be able to at least get to the right section of your field guide when you're interested in seeing what a bird is. Okie dokie. So we're going to come to ducks again. So we've chatted a little about ducks already. This is the dabbling ducks. And when we're looking at ducks when you're first beginning, I'd encourage you to probably just pay attention mostly to the males, because females are pretty difficult. They usually have pretty drab coloration in comparison to the males, and it can be pretty tricky. So if you're starting to look at ducks, you probably want to look at males first and leave the females till later on when you have a bit more experience. And if you just know it's a duck, then that's perfectly great to start. So the dabbling ducks, as I said, they're feeding up at the top of the water. They're tipping their tails in the air, feeding just underneath the top of the water. And they have their legs sort of pretty well centered in their body, so they can walk around on land pretty well. You can see them walking on land. They can take off from land, and also they're comfortable in the water. On the other hand, we have the diving ducks, and their legs are somewhat farther back on their body. They're really built for life on the water. And so you won't see these guys walking around on land. They're pretty awkward on land. They're only going to have a nest that's like really close to shore, so they don't have to spend really time on land. They also need a little bit of a runway to take off on the water because they can't take off from land again. Their wings are pretty small for the size of their body. And these ones, as we said before, you're going to see them diving underneath of the water, completely submerging their bodies to go get food. So if you are interested in identifying female ducks, it's important to take your time, I think, and try not to get overwhelmed by them because they can be quite difficult. Most of them are just this brown color, and it might seem at a first glance as there's not a lot to tell them apart, but you should focus on learning the shape of them from the males. Though the coloration is different, their shape is still going to be the same. And also take a look at the patterns on the head specifically, as well as the scapular coloration, which is that big band of color that's in the wing, especially when they're flying. But if, again, you see a female duck and you're not sure what it is, then and you just know it's a duck, then that's perfectly fine too. So don't even worry if you can't get farther than that for now. You have lots of time to figure them out. Another cue, I guess, is that ducks often go around in pairs, a male and a female. So you might be able to get an idea of what the female looks like because she might be swimming around with a male. All right, we'll move on to grouse and allies. This is going to be like a family title in your field guide. And so we have these four species that are in Newfoundland. These are really like chicken-like birds. They're ground dwelling. You see them, they're very comfortable on the ground. They're pecking on the ground, walking around, and they're quite awkward when they're flying. If you accidentally startle one, they will crash around in the bushes and make a big bunch of noise. And it's interesting to note that spruce grouse and ruffed grouse were actually introduced to Newfoundland, but willow ptarmigan and rock ptarmigan are both native to the island here. So we'll talk about loons. We have really our most common loon in Newfoundland is called the common loon, which is quite a convenient name. And loons are superficially duck-like. They do float on water. They spend their time on the water. You can see them diving, and they are expert divers. However, they are not a type of duck. They're a separate family. Their legs are located very far back on their body, and they're extremely awkward on land. So you're never going to see a loon walking around on the edge of the pond. And they always have to be on water to take off flying. In comparison to ducks, they have a sharper, pointier bill instead of that flat, broad bill. And they also have sort of a fluffy posterior instead of a longer tail. So I will also say there are a few other species of loons that you can see if you're in Newfoundland, but most of them are going to be farther out in bays and oceans, while the common loon is going to be on inland lakes and smaller bodies of water as well. We are very lucky on Newfoundland to have a whole bunch of seabirds here, which is really wonderful. Seabirds is not a specific category that you'll find the title for in your field guide, but these species will be grouped together sort of near the beginning of it. And the one thing that is common between them all is that they spend nearly their entire lives out in the open ocean, except for this one little section of the summer when they come back to land to join these huge breeding colonies on land. And then they go back to the ocean again after breeding season is done. So you're going to find seabirds congregated in really large groups, sometimes dozens of them, but sometimes up to several thousand of them. They fly really long distances to hunt for fish, and they're also amazing divers. We have here the diurnal raptors, and diurnal just means active in the daytime. So a lot of these are quite familiar to people, like the bald eagle and the osprey. And depending on your field guide, falcons may or may not be included under the diurnal raptors section, but I'll just include them here. So these birds, they're all going to have this very sharp pointed bill because they are carnivorous. So they're using it to rip open their prey. And they hunt from either perches or in the air. So you can often see them perched on a tree, just waiting for something to go by that they're interested in catching, or flying around like a northern harrier. You can see them flying over the marshes, hunting as they go. So these ones are really exciting to watch them. We also have shorebirds in Newfoundland. There's a lot of variety in shorebirds of their bill shape and size, and that's a really important clue when you're trying to identify these birds to species. Shorebirds always have these long legs that they use to walk around, wading in the edges of water or in long grasses. And though these are, we don't have too many shorebirds that actually breed in Newfoundland, but in the fall when they're migrating south, there's actually quite a few different species that go through. So shorebirds are another family that can sometimes be pretty tricky because they're often this gray or brown color, and they might seem quite overwhelming at first. But so take your time with them. I still to this day have trouble with shorebirds. So if you don't really know what one is when you see it and all you know is a shorebird, probably, again, you're doing really great. And take a look at their bill. Again, as I said, that'll give you a really good clue about their ID. And as per their name, you do expect to see them near the shoreline, but you can also find them in bogs like the greater yellowleg, and the Wilson snipe is also present at like edges of forest clearings and things like that as well. So they're not always found by the shore. We do also have gulls and terns in Newfoundland, as I'm sure you all are aware. Gulls are known colloquially as seagulls, and they can be pretty tricky to identify at a distance because they look quite similar, except for sometimes some small key features. It's nice that we have here only one gull with a black back called the great black-backed gull in the summer. And so that one at least is pretty diagnostic during the summer when you see it. Whereas the herring gull and the ring-billed gull are more of a gray white plumage, and they might be a bit trickier to see at a distance. So again, if all you can tell is, oh, I saw a gull at a distance, again, you're doing great. The terns are sort of like the slimmer, sleeker cousins of the gulls. They have longer, pointier wings, and because of that, they are a little bit more of aerial acrobats. If you watch them feeding over the water, it's really interesting because you'll see them flutter and flutter, and then they'll just dive into the water, and they're very skilled at aerial acrobatics. They also have a very pointy bill in comparison to gulls, so that's an important thing to note. One of the fan favorites is always the owls. So we do have several species of owls in Newfoundland. And the biggest key feature for them is probably this big flat facial disc that funnels sound into their ears. And the ears aren't visible. So on the great horned owl, these tufts of feathers aren't the ears actually, they are just tufts of feathers. The ears are flat to the head, and they're offset so that they can detect the location of their prey with greater precision. So that's really interesting. And some of these owls are active during the day, for example, the short-eared owl, but many of them are also active at night, as you would expect. And so sometimes with owls, it's fun to learn what they sound like. And then even if you can't see one, you'll at least still know what species it is. We also have woodpeckers, various species of woodpeckers here. And a lot of people are familiar with woodpeckers as well. They're those birds that you see climbing up tree trunks, sort of vertically tapping on them or poking or pecking holes in them. And most of them are found usually on tree trunks, but for example, the northern flicker here is also commonly found on the ground because they really like to eat ants. So they're often found on people's lawns, just picking ants off of them. So if you see this northern flicker on the ground, don't be confused. It is also a woodpecker. Another interesting tidbit is for this yellow-bellied sapsucker. It's not very common in Newfoundland, quite uncommon, but they poke holes into the trees and lick out the sap, actually, while most of the other woodpeckers are actually looking for insects. Flycatchers are cute little birds. They're a bit smaller than woodpeckers, and they do exactly what their name says. They catch flies. So you usually see them perching on a little branch or twig. They see a fly out and they go out and catch it, and they come back and perch on the twig again to eat it. They usually have a pretty upright posture, and sometimes they can look quite similar to each other. So learning the song or call of these can be helpful. But at least on Newfoundland, there aren't too many. Most of what we have is yellow-bellied flycatcher, where you're going to see most commonly. But these cute little flycatchers are always worth watching. We'll move on to the corvids here, and corvids include the crows and the jays, as well as the common raven. So probably a lot of people are familiar with the Canada jay. It used to be called the gray jay, and is also known as whiskey jack. And they're really well known as a bit of a camp robber or picnic robber. They'll always be waiting to steal some food from you. And so all of these birds in the corvids are incredibly intelligent. They're quite smart birds, all of them. And they're always pretty inquisitive and curious because of that. I will just go into a little bit about differences between the American crow and the common raven, because they do look so similar. So if you're looking at them when they're flying, the American crow is going to have a rounded tail, while a common raven will have a diamond shape or wedge-shaped tail. And if you're seeing them perched, you want to look at their beak, because the common raven's beak is around the size of its head, whereas the American crow's beak is a little bit smaller than the head. And we'll just talk about the swallows. We have a few species here. Swallows are aerial insectivores, which means that they catch insects on the wing. So they're always hunting insects. They have long pointed wings and they fly. They're incredibly good flyers. The way that they fly is a bit reminiscent of a bat, and they're really good at aerial acrobatics. There's a bit of a range of where you can find them. A tree swallow is very happy to live in a human constructed nest box in the middle of town, whereas a barn swallow is also pretty happy to use human structures, and a bank swallow is more likely to be out away from human influences. But these birds are all incredible flyers, and if you see a bird that looks like it's a bat, it's probably a swallow. Here we have the chickadees and the nuthatches, and people are maybe familiar with chickadees because they're pretty common feeder birds in the winter. They'll come over, they're quite inquisitive, and they'll come over to feeders quite easily. Same with the nuthatches. We don't really have white-breasted nuthatches here, actually. And nuthatches are really interesting because most birds, when they're feeding on trees, they'll move upward, but red-breasted nuthatches actually are always pointing downwards. So they have their beak down to the ground, which is very interesting to watch. And black-capped chickadees and boreal chickadees, you can tell the difference between these by the color of their cap. So boreal chickadee has a brown one, while black-capped chickadee has a black one. And in these species, the males and the females, they look the same. We also have the thrushes. So this includes robins, which most people are familiar with, as well as other thrushes. But they all have the same sort of body type. They have these long legs. They hop around on the ground and they look in the leaf litter for insects. The other thrushes are a little bit more secretive, so you're not going to see them around town usually. You're typically seeing them out in more the backwoods or up in the mountains. But they do have the same sort of body structure with the broad, deep chest and a sturdy bill. And here are the warblers, which a lot of people have as their favorite family. And they're sort of considered the jewel of the birding world because they're always these bright colors. They're really tiny little birds flitting around all the time. They're constantly moving. They're very active. So these birds often prefer higher up in the canopy. Thankfully, in Newfoundland, we don't have trees that are too tall, so you don't get a sore neck from looking at them so much. And males and females of the warblers do look different. So you'll probably have more success at the beginning of learning to identify males because their colors are so much brighter. So this is another family where I would start identifying males first and then move on to the females once you have a bit more comfort with it. They always have these small tweezer-like bills, and they use that for picking little insects off of leaves and trees. And as I said, they're always moving. And there is a lot of different warblers, so this can look pretty overwhelming if you look in your field guide. So when birds start coming back in the spring, I'll probably encourage you to only try and identify maybe these 3. They're pretty commonly found closer to towns, in the forest near town, and you can work your way from there. Once you get used to these ones and start looking at the patterns on them, then you'll be able to pick out the differences in the other warblers a little bit better. So don't get discouraged if you see a bunch of tiny little jewel-like birds. You can't tell what they are. If you know they're a warbler, you're doing good. We have sparrows and juncos here as well. These are sometimes a bit of a tricky group. Males and females look the same, and they're usually brown colorations with different variations of streaks on them. They're usually on the ground or in low-lying trees and shrubs, and they eat seeds, which is why they have this sort of broad, sturdy bill to crack seeds open. For these ones, if you're trying to identify the species, you want to look at the patterns on the face and head, as well as the breast and belly. And we'll move on to the blackbirds. We don't have too many in Newfoundland, but these are a bit larger than robins. They're usually fairly large, and they're usually this dark colors or bold colors. They're often associated with water, or they go about in pretty large groups sometimes. If you have a feeder, again, you might get large groupings of these in the winter. But they're pretty diagnostic birds to look at. And they all have this sort of long conical shaped bill as well. And we'll just talk about the finches and grosbeaks quickly. So these birds, you can often see them in cities and towns. They're pretty comfortable in human settlements. They're often also quite common at feeders, and they stick around in the winter time. So you'll still be seeing these birds around this time of year. The males and females look different from each other for some of these. Except for the pine siskin, I guess. And they are also seed eaters, so they have this strong conical bill as well to crack seeds open. And I've left this little guy, the house sparrow, till the end here, because he actually is not really very closely related to the sparrows that we've chatted about already. It's a European species. So if you're looking for this bird, you're going to find it at the back of your field guide, not in the sparrow section. But house sparrows are commonly found all over the place in towns. They'll live in any sort of crack or hole they can find in houses. And you've probably all heard them sort of cheeping incessantly in the summertime. So if you're wondering what those guys are, the males are pretty diagnostic looking with the colors on their head, and you'll be able to find them at the back of your field guide. The females are just fully brown color. So that's all of the family bird groups that we're going to go through. We didn't go through, of course, every single family that you'll find in Newfoundland, but that's a bit of an overview to get you started on how you can start looking for different things in your field guides and what to start looking for. There's a couple of things that I'll tell you about that you can use to start practicing or getting to know your birds a little bit better. The first one is a eBird quiz. You can find this online for free, and I'll send this again in the follow-up email so you don't have to jot it down. Basically what it does is you can put in your location and time of year, and it will give you little quizzes of pictures. So it'll give you this picture, for example, which is a pine grosbeak. And as you're learning, instead of using it as like an exam or a test, you can use it just to see the differences again between the birds that they come up with on the side. So you can answer it if you know what it is, or use your field guide to try and figure it out, but then also just explore the other options. And Nature, Newfoundland and Labrador, which is another organization here on the island, they're actually starting a bird learning night series this Wednesday. And that's a really good place also to go practice. They do these eBird quizzes together, and you can go practice with them for free on Wednesdays. I think they're doing it monthly. So you could check out their Facebook page and join those ones as well.
Jenna, I'm just going to jump in here and really put in a plug for Nature and Bird Learning Nights, because they really are fantastic. What they have is some of our top experts in Newfoundland taking you through the quiz, and they'll talk about which bird species it could be and sort of rule out competing species. So it's just for an hour on Wednesday night, and I don't believe you need to register. You can just come on out. So absolutely make it out to the one on Wednesday if you have the chance to, because they're definitely worth it. Sorry to interrupt, Jenna.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, definitely worth your while to go check those out. Another online resource that you can use is called Dendroica. And this is one that you can sort of curate lists on your own if you make a free account. So if you want to just go look at all the ducks, for example, you can make a list of ducks from this location, and it will give you pictures, and you can do custom quizzes and stuff like that in there. So that's a really cool spot as well to look at songs and calls if you're into that kind of thing. And the last little one that I'll share with you is the Birds Canada Photo Identification Guide. And this one, similar sort of thing. You put in your location and the time of year, and it will give you a sort of a printout page of bird species pictures. And you could use it if you want to make like a yard list or a town list or something, or if you have kids or a family that you want to go on a sort of a bird scavenger hunt and see all the things that you could see. So that's another cool one to check out as well. And thank you, everybody, for sticking around here to the end. I know it's a lot of content to go through, but I hope you feel a little bit more confident in your ability to start knowing your birds better, of knowing what to look for, and how to get through a field guide a little bit to start identifying birds. So do remember, everybody started as a beginner. So do be patient with yourself while you're learning. This is a great time of year to start learning because there aren't too many species around right now. And so you can have a bit of a slow start to it and start getting used to what sort of things you need to look for. And if you do want to get in contact about the nocturnal owl survey, again, feel free to email us about that, or the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. So thanks again, everybody. I think that if Catherine is still here, and if anybody has questions, I think we'll stick around for like 10 or 15 minutes or so. And again, as she said earlier, maybe don't try and ask too many questions about what specific bird you are wondering what it is, because now hopefully you can try and find out with this new information you have, but we're happy to answer questions about sort of broader ideas.
And yes, Jenna, I am still here. I'm just watching all of the thank yous coming in on the chat. We had some discussion in the chat about cats and ways to discourage cats in your neighborhood.
Okay.
But all I see coming in right now is just people saying what a great job you did. And I was going to say second, but I think at this point it's about 200. Thank you for the presentation.
I have a question if you're free.
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so today there were a lot of robins in central Newfoundland in my garden. It was a really warm day, and I was surprised to see them this time of year, so plentiful.
You asked that question in the chat, right? I knew there was something that I was forgetting. So it's an interesting, robins we tend to think of as migratory, but if you actually look at the range map for robins, they are in fact residents. So they're found year round, sort of in the southern part of Newfoundland. So that wouldn't necessarily cover central, but the thing about birds that are what we call partial migrants, where you have some individuals go and some stay, which actually happens to be what I studied for graduate work. So this is like my favorite question ever, I have to say. So when you have that situation, they tend to move around a little bit more in the winter. So if it was a sunny, warm day, could have just been checking things out. But yeah, robins don't, even though we think of them as a sign of spring, not all robins leave Canada in the winter.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. And Jen asked if there's a resource for identifying birds by song only. Also a really good question. Jenna, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, sure. I meant to mention that actually when I was talking about the Merlin app. They've just added, I think at the beginning of last year, a section in there for not only visual identification by answering those questions that we went through, but also you can record a sound that you're hearing at the time and it will give you potential bird species for that. So it's pretty cool. From what I've played around with it a little bit, it seems to be like pretty accurate often, sometimes not quite so much, but definitely an interesting place to start. So I'd say try that one out if you're interested in that.
It is definitely a good place to start. I will say that sometimes you can have difficulty getting it to pick up the sound that you're actually interested in. So it keeps telling you, for example, that's a chickadee, and you keep saying, yes, I know that's a chickadee, but it's the other thing I'm interested in. But it's a really, really neat app for sure. And also Jenna is going to be doing one of these webinars. I believe it's our last one in April, and she's going to be talking about identifying birds by ear. Jenna, we also have a question from Peggy in the chat about the unusual birds we get that get blown in from all over. So when they're from warmer places, are they able to leave and find their way home, or do they usually not survive? Do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's probably a bit of a case by case basis. I know some birds end up lasting the whole winter here. And then they sort of disappear in the spring as they go to where they're meant to go again. Some birds, I'm sure, don't make it if the weather ends up being too bad for what they're used to. And some birds would come here, refuel a little bit, and then head off to where they should have been to start with. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag answer for that one. But a lot would depend, I think, on the weather while they were here, for sure.
Okay, and another question, is it common for the insect and fruit eating families to eat only the one, or do they change with the seasons or specific to each? Jenna, can I tackle that one?
Sure,
because again, this is something that I actually did a little bit of work on.
Yep.
So most birds are insectivorous during the breeding season. And in fact, it's kind of key to their success, that pulse of insects that we have here in the Northern Hemisphere in the middle of the summer. So drives us all nuts, but it's really, really important for the birds because they've got sort of the timing of their breeding lined up with that peak of insect abundance so they can feed their young. Many, many migratory birds and non-migratory birds will actually switch to fruit in the fall. So for the migrants, it's actually a better source of energy to switch to fruit. And for residents, it's often the case that, that's what's available here in the winter. So there is some switching. There are some birds that will strictly stick with only one kind of food, but there is a lot of switching. Okay. And Sherry has asked, how does a cardinal survive in Ontario, but not here?
I think that if cardinals were here to start with, that they would survive because they're pretty hardy birds. And it's just a fact of where their range ends. So they never made it to Newfoundland. The way that I guess Newfoundland split off as an island didn't have them in the range to start with, and they haven't made it across on their own. But I think they could definitely survive here because they're hardy.
And ranges are shifting. Many species we're seeing pretty substantial range shifts. So you never know, you may be seeing cardinals here before you know it.
You never know, I guess. Yep.
We have a question here about when and where is the best time to see puffins in Newfoundland. So Jenna, you want to take it, or would you like me to?
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple of puffin colonies that are pretty accessible. If you're out on the East Coast, Witless Bay Ecological Reserve has a big colony of puffins, and so you can take usually a boat tour to go see that. And you go around the island and you see all this huge conglomeration of birds flying around. It's pretty incredible. Another spot that's really popular to go see puffins is up in Elliston, which is close to Bonavista. And there is quite cool because you can actually walk along the cliff edge, and then they're just on the next little outspurt of cliff close to you, and it's 20 meters away or something. So they're very cool to see them really up close and personal. Those are the two spots that I know about.
Okay, and Linda has observed that there have been cardinal sightings in the province, and that is definitely true. Cardinals are one of those birds that we do see here on occasion. As far as we know, they are not breeding here, but that is exactly the kind of thing that the Breeding Bird Atlas is interested in finding out. So if you have seen a cardinal breeding, please tell us. That's the kind of information we really, really need.
Yep.
Okay, well, the chat has stopped going crazy as far as I can tell. If I missed your question, type it again now, or just unmute yourself and speak up, and we'll be happy to answer. Give it a few minutes of awkward silence where we all stare at each other.
And there's somebody that asked about sharing a link to register for the remaining sessions. Oh, you did it.
I did that.
You're amazing. Yeah. Well done.
Yeah, and we'll include that link as well in the follow-up email that we send out. So if you're interested in registering for our other sessions, all of them or one or two of them, you are more than welcome to do so. We'd love to have you.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think we will call it there. Thank you very, very much, everyone, for coming out tonight. And thank you, Jenna, for such a spectacular presentation.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, everybody, for coming. It's great that everyone has so much interest. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, and we hope to see you next week.
Yeah, have a good night, everyone.
Good night.